Welcome to the Nazareth University Centennial Podcast. I'm your host, Timothy Nealand, and in each episode, I'll be guiding you through stories of amazing alumni, fascinating faculty, or the hidden history of the university. I'm Timothy Nealand, and I am delighted to have with me Ann Allen, a 1971 graduate of Nazareth University. Tell me about her time at Nazareth and how Nazareth helped her in her career as a reporter, editor, and eventually journalism professor. Then, of course, we'd also like to talk about her book, Holocaust Refugees in Oswego. Ann has been so kind to come to campus a couple of times to talk about it, but we'd like to have this on the podcast so you, the listener, can enjoy it if you couldn't attend. I'm going to just ask Ann to introduce herself.
Okay, well, when I was at Nazareth long ago, I was Ann Callaghan from Oswego, New York. Now, fast forward many years, I'm Ann Callaghan Allen, retired in Oswego, New York. So, and I've done a whole bunch of different things. I was an editor for a while. I was a news reporter. I guess I couldn't hold a job very long. I don't know. No, it was attention span, I think. And eventually, I started teaching on the college level, and I found I loved it. And I wanted to thank a woman at Nazareth who was my advisor. Her name was Suzette Graham. And she was an English professor, but she was also my advisor. And I remembered that long, long ago when I was getting ready to graduate, she said to me, Ann, you really should consider going on for your master's and maybe beyond. I think you would enjoy college teaching. And of course, as a 21, 22-year-old upstart in the early 70s, I said, nope, that's not for me. I don't want to be a teacher. So I feel bad about that because she was exactly right. People should listen to their advisors. It took me a long time to take her advice, but when I did, I really enjoyed it. I taught for a while. I taught a year at SUNY Morrisville. I taught 7 years at SUNY Oswego, and then 14 years at Le Moyne. And I just loved it. It was great. So, Suzette Graham, you were right all along.
So you were an English major.
I was an English major and political science. I don't know why. I guess because it was the late 60s, early 70s, and there were the whole protests of the Vietnam War were going on, the Nixon presidency, and I just, you become aware of a lot of things on a college campus, which is good. And there was a lot of political awareness going on at the time. I remember going to a protest at the University of Rochester, maybe more to meet boys from the University of Rochester but it was, we did that. When I was here, Nazareth really changed quite a bit. The political science, I think, came out of this kind of wider awareness of what was going on in our country, certainly, and then obviously in Vietnam. So I double majored. Yeah.
You became a journalist, which makes sense.
For a certain period of time.
You came to Nazareth. Did you come in 1967?
I came in I guess it was end of August, September of 1967. All dressed up. We were expected to dress up. We couldn't go to what was then Pittsford Plaza unless we wore skirts or dresses. It was all women. And wow, things changed over the next 4 years. But it was kind of an oasis. It was a beautiful, Nazareth is a beautiful campus anyway. I mean, it's expanded quite a bit. But it was a great place to kind of transition from home and a fairly protected environment to the wider world. So at the time, St. John Fisher was smaller than and younger than Nazareth. And one other person in my class was majoring in political science, and we needed to I guess there were more courses offered over there. So I remember we would get on this small little bus, and the driver would take us over to St. John Fisher. And there were some students at Fisher who came and took classes at Nazareth. So that was sort of the beginning of the, what are we going to make one or both coeducational? I remember vividly in my junior year, Dr. Radley was here. She was the Dean of Arts and Sciences. And I think there was a kind of a discussion anyway going on at the time about whether the two schools should merge. And Dr. Radley, as I recall, was very insistent that Nazareth stay an independent institution. And so it did, and as did St. John Fisher. She used to scare the wits out of me, though. I used to have to go and meet with her once a week because we still had a student government then, and I was what they called an academic coordinator. I don't know why, but I was the student liaison to Dr. Radley, and she was a very gifted teacher, administrator. I never took a class from her, but I interacted with her a lot, and I remember I would sit outside her office waiting for her to summon me in. And the irony is, of course, she moved to the State University of New York at Oswego and became the first, I think she was the first female president of a SUNY system school. And my husband was practicing law at that time and ended up representing Virginia Radley. He came home one day and said, I got a new client. I'm like, she's scary.
So you have some fond memories.
I do.
Being here.
Oh, yeah.
And,
yeah.
You graduate, and so your first job was where? Where did you?
Of course, I remember, I went back to school, actually. I remember applying for jobs, and I moved back to Oswego, and this one man, I can't remember, it was some office worker job, and I had to take a typing test, and he said afterwards, Ann, you got a college degree, you seem like a nice person, but you can't type fast enough for me. So I said, I've got to go back to school. And I don't think I was an atypical, college graduate, still trying to figure out what it was I wanted to do, except as I told Suzette Graham, I did not want to be a teacher. And so I ended up in Washington, D.C. at this is going to sound ironic, at the Washington Montessori Institute to learn how to become a Montessori teacher. This is the desperation that was, my father he said, you have to get a job. I paid for 4 years of school. If this doesn't do it, we're done.
And I should point out to our listeners, this is the early 1970s, and we're going through a recession. It was difficult to find a job for anyone
it was.
at that time. It wasn't you, Ann.
Well,
it was the state of the economy.
I have to take some responsibility for this. I do. But what I was lucky. I went down and they accepted me. And I thought, okay, this will put off trying to find a job again, and maybe I can learn to type faster for another year. And the head of the Washington Montessori Institute said, do you have a place to live? And of course I didn't. And she said, well, we have these situations where you can room with a family in return for room and board. And they have young children. And because you're in a program that's educating young children, they like to get students from our Montessori Institute. And I said, okay, because I didn't have a choice. I ended up living with the family of Marvin and Mady Kalb. Marvin Kalb was the diplomatic correspondent for CBS News at the time. He's still around. He's 95 or 96, as is Mady, his wife. And I had a wonderful experience with them. They had two girls who were then 6 and 8. Easy, I grew up in a family of girls, and they were in school. It wasn't hard to do. I lived on the 3rd floor of their house in Chevy Chase, and I met some amazing people because they entertained, and I would help them. I would help Mady, cow, serve food or whatever. And I met all of these national journalists, and I met a lot of politicians as I was serving food. They weren't there to meet me, but it was a tremendous learning experience. But it ended up being a wonderful experience, and we correspond to this day.
Oh, that's
Yeah, it's
delightful.
great. I still send Debbie and Judy, their daughters, Christmas presents. And then when I left there, I had a job in Philadelphia, actually starting a Montessori school for it was then a junior college, Harcum Junior College, and it was near Swarthmore and Bryn Mawr. So I did, I guess, follow Suzette Graham's
Right, you were in
advice
education.
to some extent. Yes, because I knew how to be a Montessori teacher, and I did that for a couple of years. Got married, and my husband was in law school in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, Temple, and so that kind of got me through a couple of years, and him, and then we moved back because he had an offer in Syracuse for a law firm there, and so we moved, and then it was like, okay, I need to reinvent myself again. And because of my time in Washington, I got even more interested in, politics and journalism. So I got a master's degree at Newhouse, and it was in radio, television, film, and then promptly got pregnant with my oldest daughter. So, I did. That's when I got into journalism. I was a reporter because I could go out at night, and I worked for, at that point, Syracuse had 3 newspapers. Those were the good old days. And so I did a lot of reporting and writing. So I went to work as the editor for a group of publications, all of which have, of course, disappeared. They're weekly publications. And I did that, oh my gosh, for quite a while. And then they were sold to a larger conglomerate. And again, I was like, okay, I don't know what I'm going to do, but maybe it's time for me to stay home and enjoy myself for a little bit. And then there was this job that came up, teaching English at Morrisville College. And I applied, and they hired me.
How did you come to write the book on Fort Ontario?
Well, my husband was on the board of the museum there at the time, and was talking about the fact that, this was a unique part of not only Oswego's history, but U.S. history. And yet so many people still don't know about it. And he was especially focused on trying to get more people from Oswego and Central New York to come to the museum. So I said, well, why don't you do like an exhibit or a program on Oswego's part in in this event? And because a lot had been written about the refugees, but not so much about what was going on in Oswego at the time. And like most of my ideas, he was like, yeah. And then I happened to see a Facebook post from this young man whose dad owned a tailor shop for years in Oswego, but he said, my father was trained by one of the refugees at the fort. So that piqued my interest again. And I did some research, and I found that this refugee who, eventually turned the tailor shop over to his apprentice in Oswego, had this dramatic story. And I thought, wow, I wonder what. So his name was Jake Silber. The Oswegonian was Joe Sperino. And I thought, I wonder what Joe Sperino was doing during that time. I could see literally in my mind, because he was military age, he was a young man, him crossing the Atlantic over to Europe while Jake Silber's coming to Oswego. So I got this idea of paths that wouldn't have crossed except for the extraordinary circumstances of war. And so I pitched the idea to the history press, because it's a history story. And about 2 or 3 weeks later, an editor called me and said, I want to publish this book. And I said, wow, that's wonderful. And he said, have you written it? And I said, okay, this is going to be the end of the conversation. But he was very happy that I hadn't written it yet. But then I was a little worried. Was this the only story? Fortunately, happily, as it turned out, there were many, many stories. So that's how that book came to be. It came out in March of 2024. I was contacted by my editor, who has a great name, Banks Smither, in February of 2023. And so I wrote it basically. A lot of people are surprised, how did you write a book so fast? But first of all, there were a lot of resources right in Oswego. And as I said, I started it in the dead of winter at Oswego. There's not much more to do there. So it's good to be kind of bundled up in a library reading old documents. Yeah. So the beginning was obviously because there was so much pressure finally put on Franklin Roosevelt from a number of fronts that he said, all right, I'm going to establish what I'm going to call an emergency refugee shelter. That way he didn't have to ask Congress. I'm going to limit it to 1,000 people. And I don't want them all to be Jewish. I want them to be representative of various persecuted minorities. He said, I want them housed in a facility on the Atlantic seaboard, so it will be easy for them to return to their home countries once the war ends. They can't work while they're here. I don't want anyone of men of military age, because we have our men fighting overseas. He said, I'd like a mix of skills so that with the help of local people, they can essentially run the shelter themselves. Those were the rules. Then they were delivered to the military in Naples, Italy, where all these people were fleeing because the Allies had moved into Italy. There was a British military officer and an American military officer who were taking the applications for these people. And as you can imagine, it was a mass of people pushing, shoving, trying to get, they were desperate. And they signed the document that said, I'll go back. But, apparently the British commander or the British military official said, just sign it. They won't pay any attention to this. I mean, these were people they were commanding troops that were fighting. This was the last thing they needed to do. So they just wanted it done. The Secretary of Interior, Harold Ickes, sent Ruth Gruber, who was a young diplomat at the time, in his office. She actually convinced him to send her to Italy to escort the refugees who were selected across the ocean to New York and ultimately to Oswego. And she became a fierce advocate for them. She spoke many languages, so she could converse with them. She taught them some English. So what happened was, in the end, it was supposed to be 1,000, but they boarded 982. One who was basically delivered on the way to the ship. They called him International Harry. Yeah. I don't know what his birthplace is listed as, and Ruth Gruber took care of them for can't remember how long the voyage was. And she traveled with them from New York City to Oswego. She helped get them settled. She went back and forth many times. And actually, this story probably would have been lost to history, except in the early 80s, Ruth Gruber wrote a memoir of her time in Oswego called Haven, which is still available. And it's a remarkable story about how this all happened, how it was kind of a miracle, really, because there were so many obstacles in the way. But in the end, it was brave people, young diplomats in the Department of Treasury who exposed what was happening with state to the president and pushed him to do something. Newspaper columnists who were advocating for free ports for refugees. And Ruth Gruber, who was she was in her 20s. Her boss made her an admiral because he said, if you're captured, they can't kill you. If you're an admiral, they can only imprison you. So thankfully, just the right people were in place at that time. Good people, brave people who were willing to put themselves out to try to save people from this horrible Holocaust that was going on. And so, thank goodness she wrote about it. And people started sharing stories again. And at that point, the refugee stories were fully developed. She knew where they were, what they were doing, and these remarkable contributions that they'd made to the country. So in the end, the shelter closed in January of 1946. Well, I think it took until the early part of February for everybody to leave. The question was, at that point, Harry Truman was president, and he finally got sick of all of the discussions about this and said, you know what? They're staying. And that's it. If they want to stay, they're going to stay. I mean, really, the buck did stop with him. And the question, though, was they did not have any status in the United States because they were guests of the federal government. So how to allow them to stay? And what they did was Oswego is not that far from Niagara Falls. They were put on buses, those who wanted to stay, brought across Niagara Falls on the Rainbow Bridge. There's a metaphor. There's my English major coming back. And they declared themselves to Canadians Customs as people who wanted to emigrate to the United States. And they got their papers, and then the bus took them back across into the United States. That's how they got here.
The book is marvelous, and
thank you.
Just to tease for the listeners, do you have a favorite story from the book that you'd like to share to get people to buy the book, which is available on Amazon, many local bookstores?
Oh, there's so many stories. Do I have? I guess again, having spent enough time now in classrooms, not elementary school classrooms, but other classrooms. There's sort of a magic that happens in a classroom, or can. And I really love the stories of the school-age kids who entered, I think it was 5 different Oswego schools, as well as the high school and the college. But 2 elementary schools and one of the Catholic schools. No, 3 elementary schools. And the interactions between, once the Oswego kids got over their initial guarded kind of, who are these people, strangers in our midst, and the refugee kids got used to interacting with the Oswego kids, magic happened. There is a great story, though, that I guess I would say it is one of my favorites. There was a reporter from the New York Post, and she was a freelancer. She also worked for Women's Home Companion, which was a big magazine at the time. Her name was Naomi Joles, and she took a particular interest in the shelter. And she came back and did stories a number of times. So they came in August. Of 1944, or August 5th, 1944. By at the end of Labor Day weekend, all of the school-age children, thanks to the superintendent of schools at the time, were integrated into the public schools and one of the Catholic schools. And so it was, mid-November. It was getting towards Thanksgiving. And now, Naomi Joles was in a classroom. I can't remember exactly where, but somehow it was elementary school classroom, and the discussion was about the Pilgrims. And one of the refugee students said, "Who are the Pilgrims?" And so the Oswego kids, because, they were challenged by these refugee kids, that it was like their time to shine. So they said, well, they came to the United States, to escape religious persecution. And the young refugee student who asked said, "Oh, so we're like the Pilgrims." She relates it much better than, in fact, I quote her directly in the book. She said, that got the Oswego kids to thinking, if, I think it was Carl, is like the Pilgrims, and we love the Pilgrims, then what's wrong with refugees? And she said, in her conclusion, the answer was obvious.
This book has been very well received.
The more we tell this story, and I say it's not because I'm a good writer, it's because it's a really good story. And the more the story's told, I think people are amazed, really, that this did happen. We're talking 80 some years on, it'll be almost 81 years. And I think, particularly now, the fact that it's a story of a community of 20,000 that suddenly saw almost 1,000 refugees enter their midst at a time when a lot of the same problems that we're experiencing now were going on then, and yet they made it work. And I think there's great lessons in that. But it's not just a lesson for Oswego or the upstate New York. It's a lesson really for the world.
This book is so important, and I hope our listeners will get a chance to pick up a copy. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
being my guest.
Thanks. It's great to be back.
Thanks to you, the listener. If you like what you hear, let us know. You can like and subscribe on your favorite podcast platforms, and love it if you'd leave us a review. Thank you, and until next time.